Good morrow, nerds. It is I. Failing things sucks. Whether it's failing exams, failing to impress someone, or failing a role in a tabletop RPG, you'll inevitably feel a painful tug in your gut whenever it happens. But does it need to happen? The American YouTuber and game designer Matt Colville certainly doesn't think so. And so, in his new fantasy tabletop RPG, thus far codenamed the MCDM RPG, he's decided to remove missing attacks from the entire game. There is no rolling to hit, you just roll damage. And this has ruffled quite a few feathers. So, let's talk about it. Is failing a single attack as unheroic as Matt seems to think it is? And is just letting the player characters hit whenever this vile participation trophy TikTok generation nonsense that some people online seem to think it is? But before we go any further, I have 3 buttons that I'd love if you'd click, and those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. Before we go any further, a quick disclaimer. I am a backer of the MCDM RPG. I gave them my $65, or in my case actually £53.09, on backer kit to fund the project, in exchange for eventually receiving the 2 PDFs. Now, I am not a huge fan of Matt Colville or his work myself. I actually did enjoy some of his early running the game videos. They helped me learn how to GM back when I was starting out 5 years ago. However, the more that I listened to him, the more that our GM philosophy started to diverge. And having picked up Strongholds and Followers, his first book, I was rather unimpressed with it. That said, when I picked up that initial book, I ended up subscribed to the MCDM newsletter. And they have been spamming me with Kickstarter book campaigns ever friggin' since. For the most part, I ignored them. But having heard a whole bunch of humdrum about the MCDM RPG, and then being constantly freaking emailed about it, what I should have done was unsubscribe. What I did instead was cave and buy the PDFs. I never expected to actually like the RPG itself, but I did expect that it would fairly well achieve its design goals. While I may not agree with Matt Colville, I don't think he's an idiot. And even if it does fail to be the sort of RPG that it wants to be, this cinematic tactical mumbo jumbo, well, you can learn from failure just as easily as from success. So, let's talk about it. How does combat work in the MCDM RPG? Or how does anything work in the MCDM RPG? Because everything that I've seen about this game, be it from Colville himself or from anyone else talking about it, all revolves around the combat. There actually is apparently going to be a negotiation system, which actually sounds decent. But nobody's talking about it, and with good reason. This is not a game with a combat system, this will be a combat system with a game. But to explain how that combat system with a game works, here's the Game Zone designer, James Introcaso.
The other thing that we do is the roll to hit. We don't have anymore. When you make an attack against somebody, you roll damage, and you deal them that damage.
Okay, well, why would you want to do this? Every RPG that I have played up to this point has made you roll to see if you hit or miss as a player character. Be that D&D 5e, Over the Edge, Cyberpunk Red, Call of Cthulhu, Conan 2D20, Savage Worlds, Burning Wheel, Torchbearer, The Witch is Dead, a one-page RPG. All of them have made you roll to see if you hit or miss. So why does the MCDM RPG want to buck this trend?
And that gets rid of the roll to hit, which is basically a roll to see if you have a turn. Right?
Yeah.
That, like, if I roll a 1 on my turn, I'm just not doing anything. That's not fun. And it doesn't feel heroic. That can be good for some other pulp games or dungeon crawling games where it's like, oh wow, I really got to do this. But if you want to feel like a hero, you should be doing something effective every round.
And you know what? There do seem to be people who actually agree with the sentiment.
And I fully support getting rid of misses and making your turn actually matter. I think this is actually one of my favorite things about the MCDM RPG that's going on right now. The discourse in the space is just so entertaining, and the amount of people that take issue with getting rid of, to hit rolls. I think waiting like 20 minutes for your turn, just being bored out of your mind, and then just rolling the d20 and missing, and that's your turn, that sucks. So I really like the ideas that he has in play here of you always hit, it's just a matter of how much damage you do. There's always like another effect that happens on your turn, so it's very tactical and your choices actually matter every single time. I like the way that he's structuring the initiative system where you roll and then either the party goes or the monsters go, and then one party member goes, you guys get to choose, monster goes, another party member, etc., etc. I think it's a really good way of addressing people just zoning out, maybe buying health insurance in the middle of a session. Not that I've ever done that before, because RPG combat's really boring.
Let's be as charitable as we can with these arguments. It is true, as a player in an RPG, you do spend a lot of your time sitting around. Unlike the GM, who is involved in every single interaction that happens at the table, unless it's your turn in combat, or the GM has given you spotlight out of combat, you don't have much to do besides be the peanut gallery. And as I've said in previous videos, if I'm in a large group dealing with long, slow combats, I will get bored and my brain will melt. This happened to me in a level 17, level 18 D&D campaign, and it happened to me again in a Savage Worlds campaign with like 6 or 7 players and a bunch of homebrew rules for NPC minions and things that just slowed things down. So, when you actually get your moment in the sun, when it's your turn, if all that happens is you roll a bunch of dice and they tell you, nope, nothing to do for you, sure, that can be frustrating. I get that. When I'm playing in person, I do enjoy the feeling of rolling dice. And when I'm playing online, I still enjoy the feeling of actually, doing something. However, there is another side to this argument. The first one that I've seen is that it makes combat actually a bit flatter. The fact that you inevitably know that the NPC needs to die, you just have to keep battering away at it, can make combat feel a lot more predictable. Second, failing rolls can be dramatic, and that includes failing to hit. If you had one last chance to kill that NPC before they kill one of your allies, and you fail, well, the campaign just took a very interesting turn. And as an addendum to this, not every fail is a do-nothing fail. As my Cyberpunk players will know, if you critically fail a roll, something happens. Oh boy, does something happen. I should note that in Cyberpunk Red, there is officially no special effect for critically failing a roll, but in my opinion, there should be, and since I'm the GM, if you roll a 1 and then a 10 on your roll, yes, I will destroy your weapon. I've done it multiple times, including last session. The third argument against that I've heard is the participation trophy argument, that taking away the possibility of failure kind of strips success of its meaning. I'm actually not a huge fan of this argument, simply because it doesn't actually apply here. The issue with participation trophies, and the reason that I personally don't like them, is they take away from the reward for competition. If you've been grinding away as hard as you can to crush your enemies, and then your enemies get rewarded anyway, that is infuriating. I've had this happen to me in competitions before, where I have worked hard, won, and then been told that everyone was a winner. The worst part about that incident was the woman from the other team said, I'm so glad that everyone's a winner, that way no one feels bad. While I was standing there, quietly feeling bad for having put effort into winning. But that is a story for another time. Tabletop RPGs are not a competition. I don't think the same logic applies here. But there is a slightly better argument that you could make, and that is acclimatization. You see, as Intricasso himself noted, you're still rolling for damage, and that means you can still have a lowest possible roll. Now, in a normal RPG, rolling as low as possible would either be just a flat failure or a critical failure with some additional negative effect. In MCDM's case, it is still a success, but the worst possible success will, over time, come to feel like a failure. Not that I've ever published a best-selling book before, but I am told by people who have that the first time you do it, it feels amazing. The second time, it feels okay. The third time you do it, you barely feel a damn thing. Not only would you eventually feel that creeping sense of numbness with success, but eventually, that minimum possible success will end up feeling like failure, because it will be the worst possible condition, and the human brain has a nasty habit of finding the worst in everything. But there is one detail we're missing. We can get into this argument back and forth. Should missing be possible? Should missing not be possible? Should be possible for everyone? Should be possible only for PCs or only for NPCs? But we are missing the point. I will bring you back to this clip from earlier.
I think it's a really good way of addressing people just zoning out, maybe buying health insurance in the middle of a session. Not that I've ever done that before, because RPG combat's really boring.
20 minutes for a combat round is probably an exaggeration, as is the whole buying health insurance thing. Although, I have actually sold health insurance in character in a tabletop RPG before while playing Cyberpunk Red. Our mission was to plant a homing tracker on a cargo container so that a corporate assault team could then come and collect it. But to do that, we had to get onto the cargo container. And the ruse that we used, given that my character worked for a medical corporation, was saying, hey, we'd like to sell you and your crew health insurance. So we rented ourselves a boat and headed on over to it. The GM actually made us roll to climb a ladder to get aboard the cargo ship, which any aspiring GMs in the audience, please don't make your characters roll to climb ladders out of combat in non-stressful conditions. At best, their performance will be average, and at worst, they'll just look incompetent. However, our GM had no issue with making us look incompetent, and so while most of us succeeded on our rolls, one guy didn't, and splooshed back into the boat. He did get onto the cargo ship eventually, and feeling rather embarrassed, he decided to eat his feelings. Good news for him, there was a sushi machine nearby. Now with 30% actual meat. Whatever the other 70% was, it caused him to fail his endurance roll, and he became violently sick. But this gave him the perfect cover to run off, plant the tracker, and come back. But that was only possible because my character was distracting the crew with a sales pitch for health insurance. And so I made my rolls, some very good rolls mind you, and I actually sold them health insurance. So not only did we complete our mission, but I got an extra commission from the corp for, signing up a new customer. Terrible shame that a bunch of the crew would then die during that assault team's drop-in, but whatever, paperwork hasn't cleared, we didn't need to pay for them, who cares? That tangent aside, the reason that I bring this point up is that I'm not convinced that the MCDM RPG is actually capable of dealing with the I got bored in the middle of a session and went to go do health insurance problem. James Introcaso, who I've mentioned a couple of times now, did a sample combat for comicbook.com and their YouTube channel, The Character Sheet. Now, I've linked to it below and you can go watch it. In fact, I recommend that you do. I took notes on how long everything took and then put those notes into an Excel spreadsheet. You can find a prettied up copy of that in the description down below to check out at your leisure. To give you a bit of context, there were 2 player characters, a tactician and a shadow, those being 2 of the game's classes. It also featured 3 enemy NPCs, those being goblins. A stabby goblin, a shooty goblin, and a spelly goblin. Those weren't their actual names, but I can't remember what those names are off the top of my head because they're weird and annoying. So we will call them shooty, stabby, and spelly. Now spelly does die in round 1, but a spider crawls out of that spelly goblin and takes over as an extra enemy. Because of this, throughout most of the combat, it's 2 PCs versus 2 NPCs. At the start it's 2 versus 3, at the end it's 2v1, but you get the idea. Now this combat took 44 minutes and 19 seconds by my count, and lasted 6 and a bit rounds. There was a 7th round, but there was only 1 turn in that round, so we'll call it 6.5. What this means is that an average round lasted 6 minutes and 19.9 seconds, or 6 minutes 54.5 seconds if you ignore that final round. Although notably, given that the longest round, the first round, was 12 minutes 43 seconds, and the shortest round, round 6, was 2 minutes 51 seconds, there is a lot of swing in how long a round can last. An average turn lasted 1 minute 42.7 seconds, with the average for players only being 1 minute 50, and the average for the GM only being 1:34.1. Now, why am I spitting all of these numbers at you? MCDM's RPG is not meaningfully faster than most other RPGs. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that it's probably a bit slower. I would have given them more grace, but the 15.9 second gap in duration between player and GM turn lengths doesn't really allow for that. If even the players who've never played the game before don't take that much longer than the GM, who definitely has played the game before, then the combat isn't particularly quick. Now bear in mind, 6-7 minutes for a combat round isn't bad, especially for a small group, but the issue here is just the sheer number of rounds it took. My personal rule is that I consider 1 to 2 rounds a short combat, 3 to 5 medium, and anything 6 rounds or over to be long. Now especially in Cyberpunk Red, I've had some very long combats, like over 10 rounds long. But that was a very unusual case, to say the least. In general, most of my combat rounds with an average-sized group tend to last 10 to 15 minutes. And if you extrapolate out and say that a typical full-length round in the MCDM RPG with an average 4 combatants takes 7 minutes, then for a larger combat with, say, 8 combatants, 4 PCs, 4 NPCs, that'd be 14 minutes. We're on the upper end of that, that's fine. But, as I said, I consider an average length combat to be 3 to 5 rounds. Again, let's call that 4. If I'm running an average combat with an average length of 12.5 minutes per round, taking the middle of my normal range, and multiply it by 4, you get 50 minutes. That is slightly longer than this combat, but with double the number of players and NPCs. If you take the MCDM RPG's pace, again take that 14-minute time, and take, let's say, 6.5 rounds, because that's how long this took, then you get 91 minutes. You get an hour and a half for a single combat at level 1. MCDM is a class and level based system that is heavily inspired by 4E D&D, and thus it has lots of abilities and powers for the players to use, and they will only get more as they level up from 1st all the way up to 10th level. Now, you will remember that I said at the start of this video that one of the only times my brain has melted during combat in an RPG from boredom was 17th and 18th level D&D 5e. And that is because of just how long it takes to figure out all the rules and interactions with all of the abilities you have by that point. MCDM RPG at higher levels probably won't fare any better. And so realistically, even if you are doing things every 10 to 15 minutes, you're going to be doing a lot of things over and over and over. And so in large groups or in high levels, you may find yourself only getting through one encounter a session. And when I say one encounter a session, I mean just one encounter a session. No exploration and roleplay before and after, just that. That's the worst case scenario. Now, to be fair, we don't know what the MCDM RPG will look like at higher levels, partly because the higher levels haven't been made yet. But I think that Colville here has missed the point. If you want the players to be as switched on and engaged as possible and having fun and being excited, and if you further believe that the only way to do that is to have them doing fun, exciting things on their turn, that's theoretically fine, but in practice, it does miss the point. Again, there is plenty of time for MCDM to fix this, to tune up the combat so that they do go quicker, especially at higher levels, but this is a point to be made. A final note, this is what the video was meant to be about until I got distracted doing calculations in MS Excel to figure out how long the combats were taking, is whether always succeeding feels heroic. On some level, yes it does. Most heroic stories end with the hero succeeding. I'll be leaning heavily on Robert E. Howard's Conan stories because I've been reading them at the moment, and because they're a good example of a very powerful heroic character, at least in my opinion. Now, Conan succeeds at the end of pretty much all of his stories. I've not read all of them yet, I've still got a couple left, I'm partway through People of the Black Circle, but so far he has always succeeded. Now, sometimes that success has been bittersweet, as in Queen of the Black Coast, but a success by any other name is still a success. One important detail about Conan, though, is that while he does always succeed by the end of his adventures, he isn't necessarily very successful during them. Quite the opposite. In the aforementioned Queen of the Black Coast, he is knocked out by the Black Lotus. He spends a good amount of time unconscious, and by the time that he wakes back up, all of his companions are dead, including his lover Belit. Oh yeah, spoilers by the way for 90-year-old stories. Now, interestingly, Conan does seem to succeed at most if not all of his attacks. In fact, a good majority of his attacks are death blows, even against, gigantic snakes, or inhuman semi-divine creatures. I'm looking at you, Khosrotel Kell. Although, to be fair with Khosrotel Kell, Conan's blows with his scimitar do all fail to do damage, but his first hit with that UHE dagger does do damage. Rather a lot of it. So if you wanted to look at an example of a heroic protagonist, you can certainly find examples of heroes who barely miss or never miss. So yeah, if you want to do cinematic, tactical, heroic combat, maybe you can go without missing hits. But even Modiphius, when they made the 2D20 Conan game, which I've mentioned 2 weeks in a row, even when they made that game, they still allowed the players to miss. Now, I run it. Not recently, but I have run it. And I'm gonna be honest, PCs in that game don't miss very often, especially if they're good at hitting things. And NPCs in that game miss very often, especially if they're not quite as good at hitting things as the PCs are, which, if you're running things out of the bestiary or even just slightly upping the stats on them, is quite a lot of NPCs. Seriously, I had a really hard time doing any damage to my players in Conan 2D20. In a similar vein, Cyberpunk Red has a strong imbalance between the power of PCs and NPCs. Almost every NPC in Cyberpunk Red has significantly weaker stats than even a starting PC, let alone a PC who's had time to improve their skills and rank up their role abilities. So if, hypothetically, you want an NPC with a skill of 10 with their weapon to hit a PC with an evasion of 14, because either you're doing this in melee or it's ranged and the PC has 8 reflexes, you have about a 20% chance of hitting with each attack, which is incredibly low. You will hardly ever hit. And likewise, if you are a PC with a 14 in your weapon skill, going up against an NPC with 5, 6, 7, 8 evasion, yeah, you're going to be hitting just fine. If you really want to slant things in the PC's favour, there are plenty of other RPGs that find other ways to do it without removing misses. To bring this rather rambly video to a close, I don't really have a strong opinion on the not letting PCs miss thing. I do think it's unnecessary, but if you pull it off, there's not like a huge amount of issue with it. That being said, I do still think that there will be issues with the MCDM RPGs, specifically regarding combat and pacing. I think they've spent too much time thinking about how combat works on an action-by-action level, and not on an encounter-by-encounter level. Again, my example is one combat encounter with newbie players. But if you up the number of players, or you up the complexity of the encounter by upping the level of the players and monsters, well, you're not going to get any better results than what you saw in that example, at least in my opinion. So the final lesson to any aspiring game designers out there is don't miss the forest for the trees. Do not become so hyperfixated on one element of gameplay that you ignore it to the expense of everything else. The MCDM RPG claims that it takes nothing for granted, apart from fantasy RPGs having classes, levels, and lots of combat. But if you're going to take all of that for granted, then don't be taking pacing for granted with it. That is my warning. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. Are you interested in the MCDM RPG? What do you think of it so far? Am I wrong? Am I right? Let me know, I'm curious for feedback. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel. Now, speaking of games with inordinate amounts of combat, I am late for my Pathfinder game, again, so I am going to go run off to that. Once more though, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.